In the spring of 1829, a tenant farmer was guiding his plow across the quiet farmland that bordered the Maryland countryside when his horse suddenly lurched and sank into the earth. The man rushed forward, expecting perhaps an old well or a patch of unstable soil. Instead, what he unearthed was something far darker. Beneath the churned ground lay a wooden chest, and inside were bones yellowed with age, yet bearing unmistakable marks of violence. The farmer could not have imagined that this chance discovery would unravel one of the bloodiest family-run enterprises in American history. Over the following weeks, investigators uncovered more. Graves hidden beneath the soil revealed the remains of at least 7 victims, including children. Each body whispered the same story: brutality carried out not by strangers or passing criminals, but by an organized family who had built their fortune on blood. This was no ordinary set of killings. This was the deadly legacy of America's most notorious crime family, a clan whose name had become a whispered curse across the borderlands. Their empire was not limited to murder. They operated what historians later called the reverse underground railroad, a sinister network that targeted free African Americans and fugitives who had escaped slavery. These men, women, and children were captured, stripped of their freedom, and sold into bondage in the Deep South. But the family's greed went further still. Rivals who crossed their path were killed, witnesses who might speak were silenced, and even children who became inconvenient were disposed of without hesitation. Court records from the time officially charged them with 4 murders. Yet witnesses whispered of dozens more, their bodies hidden in shallow graves and wooden crates, scattered across the family's land. Some believed the death toll stretched beyond 20, perhaps even higher. The gruesome discoveries in 1829 forced the world to confront what many had long ignored. For years, the family's operations had been shielded by loopholes in jurisdiction, by a society that largely disregarded crimes against people of color, and by the isolation of their rural stronghold. But now the truth was clawing its way to the surface, quite literally from beneath the soil. The land itself seemed designed for secrecy. The family had made their base in a settlement that straddled multiple jurisdictions, an area where county lines blurred and state authority faltered. A tavern at a lonely crossroads became the nerve center of their activities. Its very location allowed them to step across a boundary and slip away from pursuing lawmen. Dense forests, marshlands, and the slow winding rivers provided natural cover. Roads were little more than cart paths, and the nearest towns lay days away by horseback. For a criminal enterprise seeking shadows, this land was paradise. The matriarch of the clan, whose shadow loomed largest over the decades of terror, arrived in this borderland around the turn of the century. Accounts differ on her origin. Some claimed she had drifted south from Canada in her youth. Others believed she had been born farther north before marrying into the family whose name she would ultimately stain forever. What is certain is that by the early 1800s, she had become the driving force, shaping her relatives into accomplices and building their tavern into both a home and a prison dot at first glance. The family's homestead looked ordinary, a simple 2-story structure, wooden walls weathered by wind and rain, smoke curling from its chimney. But behind closed doors, the house concealed a labyrinth of hidden rooms and secret compartments, spaces designed not for comfort but for captivity. What appeared from the outside to be a humble farmhouse was, in reality, a holding facility where kidnapped men, women, and children awaited transport into lives of forced labor hundreds of miles away. The timing of their rise was no coincidence. In 1808, Congress had outlawed the importation of enslaved Africans. That law did not end slavery. It made the domestic trade even more valuable. Cotton was spreading like wildfire across Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, and planters were desperate for workers. The price of a strong young man soared from a few $100s to over $1,000. The temptation for criminals was immense. Why risk smuggling across the Atlantic when vulnerable communities of free African Americans lived just miles away, unprotected and largely invisible to the authorities? This family understood the opportunity. They lived on land surrounded by free black communities, men and women who had secured their liberty after the Revolutionary War or through manumission. But liberty was fragile. They could not vote, could not testify against whites in most courts, and were required to carry papers proving their free status. One missing paper, one forged document, and freedom could vanish in an instant. For kidnappers, these legal vulnerabilities were cracks to be pried open. Neighbors later recalled the matriarch as a physically imposing woman, unusually tall, with a voice that commanded attention. She carried herself with an air of authority that could silence a room. Behind her presence, however, was a temper quick to violence. Whispers suggested her own husband died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned, leaving her widowed and fully in command of the family property. If those rumors were true, it was the first in a long line of deaths that secured her power. The transition from ordinary settlers to architects of terror was gradual, shaped by marriages that tied the family ever more tightly to crime. Her daughters married men who already trafficked in human lives, and with those alliances, the family's tavern became more than a gathering place. It became the headquarters of an empire. Captives were hidden in cellars. Deals were struck in candlelit rooms. And when those deals threatened to collapse, knives and pistols resolved the matter permanently. The methods of abduction were simple yet effective. Sometimes a young man was lured with promises of employment. Other times, a family was approached with offers of opportunity in distant towns, only to watch helplessly as their children never returned. Force was used when deception failed, and the isolation of rural life meant few witnesses and fewer rescuers. Victims vanished quietly into the night, carried along dirt roads and riverbanks toward their fate. It was not only the kidnapped who faced danger. Rival traders who carried cash or competed for profit sometimes disappeared after stopping at the tavern. They would drink, boast of their earnings, and then never be seen again. Their wagons, their money, and their human cargo were absorbed into the family's operations. Graves around the property whispered the fate of these men, their skulls cracked by violence, their wealth feeding the machine of terror. By the mid-1820s, whispers of disappearances had grown louder. In Philadelphia, the city's mayor began investigating missing free citizens, tracing their last known steps back to the borderlands. His records showed dozens of vanishings in a single year. Yet despite mounting suspicion, the family endured. Protected by corrupt officials, fearful neighbors, and the sheer remoteness of their territory. The breaking point came only when the ground itself gave way beneath the farmer's plow in 1829. Bones surfaced, stories spread, and suddenly the crimes could no longer be ignored. What had long been dismissed as rumor and fear was now undeniable. America's deadliest crime family had been exposed, their empire of secrecy collapsing into the open air. The discovery marked the beginning of the end, but it was only the first chapter in a saga of greed, cruelty, and blood. What lay ahead would shock the nation, a tangled web of kidnappings, murders, and betrayals stretching across decades. And at the center of it all stood a family bound not by love, but by shared guilt in a business built on human suffering. When investigators began piecing together the history of the family, whose name would come to embody terror, they quickly realized that the roots of this empire stretched back decades before the first bones surfaced. The tavern at the lonely crossroads had not always been infamous. At one point, it had been a simple stop for travelers, a place where farmers might rest their horses, where peddlers might share a drink before moving on. But behind its wooden walls, a transformation was underway, one that turned an ordinary household into the command post of America's most brutal family business. The matriarch, whose iron will steered the clan into darkness, had arrived in the region at the close of the 18th century. Records of her origins are clouded, as though she took deliberate care to obscure them. Some claimed she had been born farther north, possibly in Canada, and drifted into Delaware before her marriage. Others swore she came from a family of hard-living settlers on the Maryland frontier. What is certain is that once she married into the clan that owned land straddling state lines, she seized the opportunity to turn a simple farmstead into the nucleus of a criminal dynasty. Her husband, a quiet farmer by all accounts, lived only long enough to father children and anchor the family to the soil. His death, whispered by neighbors to have come suddenly and under suspicious circumstances, left her free to command both land and household. From that point forward, the family operated less like farmers and more like a syndicate. The homestead itself became the stage for their rise to outward appearances. It was a modest 2-story structure, with fields of corn stretching behind it and a small barn slanting under the weight of time. Travelers saw nothing unusual in the clapboard siding, or the smoke drifting lazily from the chimney. Yet those who stepped inside discovered a house that seemed strangely fortified. Beneath the wooden floors, hidden doors led to cellars, carved out not for food storage, but for confinement. Iron rings had been set into stone walls, and narrow ventilation shafts had been disguised to prevent suspicion. Rooms that should have smelled of onions and grain instead reeked of dampness and fear. This duality, the appearance of respectability masking a world of terror, would become the family's greatest weapon. Neighbors might exchange greetings in passing, believing them ordinary folk, while at night wagons creaked into the yard carrying victims whose cries never reached the road. Captives were chained, stripped of their names and papers, and stored like contraband until transport south could be arranged. The system that sustained this trade was larger than the family itself. The early 1800s had created the perfect storm for such an enterprise. The ban on importing enslaved Africans had transformed the domestic market into a gold mine. The invention of the cotton gin had sparked a frenzy of cultivation, and fields from Georgia to Mississippi demanded endless labor. Planters were willing to pay sums that could make a fortune overnight. A strong young man who once cost $300 could now fetch over $1,000. For criminals, the equation was irresistible. Kidnap, transport, sell, and profit. But what made this family different was not just their participation in the trade. It was their ability to professionalize it, to transform random kidnappings into an organized network. Their tavern at the crossroads became more than a home. It was a hub of operations where associates gathered, where profits were divided, where schemes were plotted with candlelight flickering against the walls. It was here that alliances were forged through marriage, and where their daughters' unions bound them ever more tightly to men who thrived on human misery. One of those men, remembered as a blacksmith by trade, used his work as cover to scout victims. He traveled from farm to farm, shoeing horses, repairing tools, and taking careful note of which families had young sons or daughters who might be worth the highest price in southern markets. His arrest for kidnapping in the second decade of the century momentarily disrupted the family's rhythm, but even imprisonment could not halt their momentum. He escaped within the year, and before long his crimes escalated from abduction to murder. It was in those years that the family first revealed their willingness to kill not only the vulnerable, but also their own competitors. A traveling trader, heavy with coin and accompanied by enslaved laborers, was lured into their tavern with promises of rest and hospitality. He drank, boasted of his wealth, and by morning he was gone. His wagon disappeared, his money pocketed, his body buried on their land. It was a pattern that would repeat itself many times. The killing of rival traders signaled an evolution. The family was no longer content with the profits of kidnapping alone. They sought dominance. By eliminating competition, they ensured their monopoly over the trade in that lawless borderland. Each grave in the fields was both a silenced voice and a marker of the family's growing empire. Neighbors, of course, noticed oddities. They heard cries carried on the wind. They saw wagons arriving at strange hours. They whispered about the constant stream of strangers who entered the tavern yet were never seen again. But suspicion rarely translated into action. The victims were largely people of color, individuals society deemed disposable. Their vanishings provoked little outrage, and local lawmen had little appetite for pursuing cases that crossed jurisdictions. In a society already fractured by race and class, the family thrived on indifference. It was only when white men rivaled traders, carrying cash, began to vanish that questions grew sharper. Their disappearances were harder to ignore. They had partners, investors, and financial backers who demanded answers. But even then, the family's careful use of geography kept them safe. By situating their tavern precisely on a state line, they could evade warrants with a single step. If Delaware officers arrived, the suspects retreated into Maryland rooms. If Maryland officials pressed too close, they crossed back. This manipulation of borders allowed them to thrive for nearly 2 decades. By the 1820s, their network extended far beyond their home county. Evidence would later show connections stretching from Pennsylvania to Louisiana. They had buyers waiting in the deep South, men willing to pay fortunes for captives, and a steady stream of victims supplied through deceit and violence. The scale of the operation was staggering, more akin to organized crime than random frontier lawlessness. But with expansion came exposure. Families in Philadelphia began reporting missing sons and daughters. Abolitionists documented suspicious patterns. And though authorities often turned a blind eye, a few determined officials started to recognize that what was unfolding in the borderlands was not a series of isolated tragedies, but a systematic enterprise. Still, the family remained confident, even arrogant, in their security. Their matriarch ruled with an iron will, her towering figure a symbol of both strength and menace. Her voice could silence even hardened men, and her outbursts kept allies in line. To the outside world, she might have appeared a widow of stern disposition. Inside her home, she was the architect of terror, orchestrating kidnappings and murders with a calculating eye. Every secret room, every chained captive, every shallow grave was part of a design she believed unshakable. For years she had built this empire brick by brick, lie by lie, death by death. And yet, beneath the soil, the truth was waiting. Graves cannot keep their silence forever. The seeds of downfall were already sown, and soon the earth itself would betray her. What began as whispers in the countryside was slowly turning into an echo that could not be ignored. Disappearances too numerous, rival traders too often missing, rumors too persistent. The Crossroads Tavern was becoming infamous, even as its owners clung to the illusion of untouchable power. By the decade's end, the reckoning that had long been postponed was drawing closer, step by step, as investigators and circumstance closed in. The stage was set. The family had built their house on shadows, and shadows have a way of lengthening until they consume everything. Their empire was strong, but the cracks had already begun to spread. By the 3rd decade of the 19th century, the family's reach had grown far beyond the marshlands that shielded their tavern. What began as a handful of kidnappings and opportunistic murders had matured into a sophisticated network of crime. At the heart of this transformation was marriage strategic unions that tied the bloodline ever tighter to men who already trafficked in human lives. These alliances did not dilute the family's legacy. They amplified it. The matriarch's daughters, became the conduits through which new partners joined the enterprise. Their husbands, men who wore the masks of tradesmen and farmers, were in truth predators. One of them, a blacksmith by profession, embodied this duality perfectly. By day, he moved from village to village, shoeing horses, repairing plows, and speaking amiably with neighbors. By night, he transformed into a scout, identifying potential captives with the eye of a merchant appraising livestock. His work gave him legitimate reasons to travel, and in the course of those journeys, he marked out families who could be targeted with minimal risk. Parents desperate for opportunity sometimes believed his promises of work for their sons and daughters. A job on a distant farm, wages in hand, a chance at independence, it all sounded convincing. But once those young people climbed into his wagon, they vanished into the labyrinth of the family's operation. Others were taken by brute force, ambushed along roads or in the fields. In either case, the outcome was the same: chains, confinement, and eventual transport south. In 1811, this son-in-law was arrested in Delaware for kidnapping, his activities too brazen to remain hidden. But even the walls of a jail could not hold him. He escaped the same year, returning to the shadows of the borderlands. His reappearance was followed by an escalation of violence. The family no longer confined itself to abductions. They had tasted the profits of murder, and blood became another tool in their arsenal. The first widely documented killing tied to them occurred soon after. A trader, remembered only by fragments of his name, stopped at the tavern on what he thought was a routine journey. He carried a large sum of money, thousands of dollars, intended for the purchase of enslaved people. He drank with his hosts, unaware of the trap tightening around him. By morning, he was dead. His body was buried hastily in the earth, his money vanished, and his enslaved companions absorbed into the family's operations. 2 of the conspirators in that crime were eventually captured and executed. But the matriarch, whose guiding hand had orchestrated the events, evaded justice. She learned from the episode not the futility of crime, but the necessity of better planning. The message was clear. Mistakes led to arrests, but careful organization could secure impunity. From that moment on, she treated their venture not as a series of gambles, but as a business calculated, deliberate, and increasingly ruthless. The tavern itself evolved to reflect this new phase. On the surface, it remained a legitimate establishment, serving travelers food and lodging. But beneath its floorboards and behind its doors, it became a prison. Cellars were dug deeper, walls reinforced, chains affixed. The family designed these spaces not just to conceal captives, but to keep them for weeks, even months, until conditions were right to move them farther south. Wagons were outfitted for long journeys, provisions stocked, and secret compartments. Prepared to avoid detection at checkpoints. This was no longer opportunistic frontier violence. It was organized trafficking, a systematized assault on vulnerable communities. Records later showed that by the mid-1820s, their network reached as far as Louisiana, with regular sales in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. Buyers in those states came to rely on the steady flow of captives provided by the family's agents. To maintain this pipeline, they required information, and here the diversity of their gang proved vital. It included not only white outlaws, but also men of mixed race, individuals who could move between communities without raising suspicion. One in particular became infamous for his ability to assume multiple identities. In some towns, he presented himself as a free black man seeking work. In others, as a light-skinned white trader. This chameleon-like quality made him invaluable. He scouted potential victims, gained their trust, and then lured them into the family's grasp. Testimonies from later survivors reveal the cruelty of these deceptions. One young woman recounted how she was promised honest wages, only to find herself chained in a cellar for months. Others spoke of being stripped not only of their freedom, but also of their identities. Papers proving free status were destroyed, names replaced with false ones, histories rewritten to make the captives appear as lifelong slaves. In this way, the family erased the evidence of their victims' lives, ensuring that even if questions were asked, answers could not be easily found. The scale of the operation began to attract attention beyond the borderlands. In Philadelphia, Mayor Joseph Watson, a Quaker deeply opposed to slavery, grew alarmed at the number of free African Americans disappearing from his city. His investigations in 1825 alone uncovered dozens of cases that pointed back toward the family's tavern. Survivors who escaped described the hidden rooms, the chains, the fear. They told of nights spent in darkness, of the constant dread of being marched south in a line of wagons bound for markets where they would vanish forever. One such survivor, a woman named Lydia, gave chilling testimony. She spoke of being held for months in the tavern cellar, chained with others, fed meager scraps, and denied light. She recalled the despair that fell over the captives when one of them resisted, how the family's enforcers beat him until he submitted, then forced the others to watch as a warning. Lydia was eventually rescued through the efforts of abolitionist networks, but many of those chained beside her were not so fortunate. Her words painted a portrait of life inside the family's walls that would later horrify even hardened investigators. Despite these growing reports, local authorities remained reluctant to act. Corruption played its part, bribes changed hands, and indifference shielded the criminals. But even more powerful was the veil of racism that hung over society. Free African Americans had little legal standing. Their voices in court carried little weight, their disappearances often dismissed as voluntary wanderings or personal misfortunes. The family exploited this prejudice, confident that as long as their victims were people society valued least, the law would look away. Still, cracks were forming. A greed that had once fueled their rise also sowed the seeds of downfall. By targeting white slave traders' men, whose disappearances drew real attention, they brought scrutiny closer to home. And by expanding their network too widely, they exposed themselves to new risks, new witnesses, new betrayals. Through it all, the matriarch remained unflinching. Neighbors described her as towering, her voice deep and commanding, her temper ferocious. To her followers, she was both leader and enforcer, her very presence enough to maintain loyalty. Yet beneath her authority lurked paranoia. As profits grew, so too did her fear of betrayal. Associates who wavered were eliminated. Potential witnesses, even children, were silenced. It was a strategy born of both ambition and terror, and it ensured that the family's story was written in blood. By the late 1820s, their income was estimated in the tens of thousands of dollars, a fortune by the standards of the day. Their empires stretched across states, their tavern bustled with secret traffic, and their graves multiplied beneath the soil. Outwardly, they remained untouchable, but in truth, they were living on borrowed time. Every crime leaves traces, and no amount of concealment can keep secrets buried forever. The ground itself was beginning to betray them, and soon the unearthing of a single chest of bones would pull the curtain back on everything they had built. By the mid-1820s, the family's reputation was no longer confined to dark whispers among their captives. Stories had begun to seep into the surrounding communities, carried in hushed tones across tavern benches and murmured at church gatherings. People in neighboring farms could not help but notice the strange patterns that surrounded the crossroads house. Wagons arriving in the dead of night, strangers passing through but never seen again, the muffled cries that sometimes echoed on the wind. And yet these suspicions rarely ripened into action. Fear played its role. The family was intimidating, their matriarch a looming figure who inspired dread even in those who claimed to be her. Allies, but there was also a more insidious reason for the silence. The victims were largely African Americans, men, women, and children whose voices carried little weight in courts dominated by white jurors and judges. Their disappearances did not provoke outrage in the same way that the loss of a wealthy trader might. For too many, their fates were invisible, unworthy of pursuit. The borderland setting amplified this apathy. The crossroads lay at the intersection of counties and states, a legal no-man's land where jurisdiction blurred and responsibility dissolved. Delaware sheriffs could chase suspects only so far before crossing into Maryland. Maryland officials faced the same obstacle in reverse. This patchwork of authority created the perfect environment for criminals, a place where one step could place them beyond the reach of law. The family understood this advantage better than anyone. Their tavern, straddling the line, was positioned with almost surgical precision. A single doorway might place a suspect under Maryland law, while a hallway led back into Delaware's territory. If questioned, they could always claim to be in the wrong jurisdiction. Warrants grew tangled in bureaucracy, and frustrated lawmen often gave up the chase. But the family's real weapon was not geography, it was fear. They cultivated an aura of menace, a reputation that discouraged curiosity. Those who lived nearby had seen enough to know better than to ask questions. The price of prying too deeply could be disappearance. And so neighbors looked away, convincing themselves that whatever business went on at the tavern was none of theirs. This silence allowed the family to expand. Captives were kept not only in the tavern's hidden cellars, but also in the surrounding countryside. Abandoned barns, secluded farmhouses, and even underground pits were used as makeshift prisons. Each location served as a temporary waypoint, a place where victims were held until larger shipments could be arranged. The kidnappings themselves followed familiar patterns. Sometimes victims were approached with promises of employment. Other times they were ambushed on lonely roads, their cries drowned by the forest. For children, the deception was often simply a kind word, a ride in a wagon, the promise of food. Once in the family's grasp, resistance meant violence, and compliance offered no real safety. Testimonies from those who narrowly escaped painted a picture of terror. A free man named Thomas later recalled how he was approached in Philadelphia with an offer of work in Georgia. The man who offered it seemed respectable, well-dressed, persuasive. Only after days of travel did Thomas realize he had been deceived. He managed to escape into the woods during a rest stop, but many others who took the same path never returned. Survivors who remained in captivity spoke of conditions designed to break the human spirit. Hidden cellars were dark, damp, and foul. Chains anchored prisoners to stone walls. Food was meager, often scraps tossed to keep them alive but weak. Sanitation was non-existent, and disease spread easily. But perhaps the greatest cruelty was psychological. Victims were told repeatedly that no one would come for them, that their papers proving freedom had been destroyed, that they no longer had a name. The family understood that crushing hope was as effective as iron bars. The complicity of the local white community cannot be ignored. Merchants sold supplies without questions. Travelers turned blind eyes. Even some lawmen were rumored to have accepted bribes, their silence purchased with coins drawn from the profits of human misery. In this way, the family's crimes were not committed in isolation. They thrived within a society that enabled them, whether through greed, prejudice, or cowardice. Still, not all remained silent. In Philadelphia, Mayor Joseph Watson began gathering evidence. He traced missing citizens back to the borderlands, noting the alarming pattern of vanishings. His records suggested dozens of kidnappings in a single year, far too many to dismiss as coincidence. Watson's pursuit represented one of the earliest attempts to systematically confront the network. But even his efforts faced obstacles. Local authorities in Delaware and Maryland were hesitant to cooperate, wary of stepping into dangerous territory. Meanwhile, the family's confidence grew. They operated with the arrogance of those who believed themselves untouchable. Rivals were eliminated without hesitation. Competitors in the slave trade, who passed too close to their territory, often vanished. Their wagons, their coin, and their human cargo were absorbed into the family's empire. Each murder reinforced their monopoly, each burial a grim reminder of the cost of resistance. The matriarch herself was central to this aura of invincibility. Towering, broad-shouldered, and commanding, she ruled through both fear and cunning. Neighbors described her voice as deep and sharp, a sound that silenced rooms. She did not merely oversee the family's operations, she embodied them. Her decisions determined who lived, who died, and who was sold into bondage, even hardened. Men deferred to her authority, recognizing that crossing her could be fatal, but power came at a cost. The more captives they held, the more graves they dug, the greater the risk of exposure. Every cry in the night, every suspicious disappearance, added weight to the growing suspicion that something monstrous was happening at the crossroads. Though most still feared to act, the seeds of investigation were being sown. For the captives, each day was a struggle against despair. Some whispered prayers in the darkness. Others clung to faint hopes of escape. A few managed to slip away, carrying with them stories that began to circulate in abolitionist circles. These accounts, though often dismissed by mainstream authorities, laid the foundation for the storm that would soon engulf the family. By the late 1820s, the family's profits were immense. Estimates suggested their income reached tens of thousands of dollars annually, a staggering fortune for the era. Their network extended across states, their tavern hummed with secret traffic, and their graves multiplied. Yet beneath this appearance of strength, cracks were spreading. Investigators in Philadelphia pressed harder. Neighbors whispered louder. Even within the family, paranoia grew as the matriarch tightened her grip and silenced dissent with ruthless efficiency. The Crossroads Tavern, once a symbol of dominance, was becoming a beacon of suspicion. Too many wagons entered and failed to emerge. Too many travelers vanished without explanation. What had once been whispers in the community was becoming a chorus. The silence that had protected them for so long was beginning to fray. And soon, one discovery in a farmer's field would tear it apart. By the late 1820s, the family's empire had reached its peak. What began as scattered kidnappings and whispered rumors had grown into a structured, calculated business that stretched across states. The tavern at the crossroads was no longer just a meeting place or a way station. It had become the pulsing heart of a criminal dynasty that fed on human lives. Their wealth grew steadily, but with it came violence, paranoia, and the steady accumulation of bodies hidden in the soil. Economics of their trade were simple, cruel, and devastatingly effective. The ban on importing enslaved Africans had turned the domestic market into a seller's paradise. A healthy young man could command $1,000 or more in southern markets, while children, though valued less, offered decades of potential. Labor and could be molded into obedient workers. Every wagon load of captives represented a fortune in waiting. For the family, each life stolen meant money in their pockets, and the arithmetic of misery became their daily calculation. This hunger for profit demanded constant supply. The family could not simply wait for opportunities to arise. They had to create them. Scouts combed the countryside, sometimes disguised as employers offering work, other times as traders seeking business. Vulnerable families particularly free. African Americans were their most frequent targets. These communities, legally free but socially marginalized, lived under constant threat. They could not vote, could not testify against whites, and were required to carry papers proving their status. Any slip, any missing document, could make them appear enslaved, and once taken, their protests fell on deaf ears. The family exploited these weaknesses with precision. Victims were stripped of their papers, their names erased, their belongings destroyed. In southern markets, they were presented as runaway slaves, their identities rewritten to suit the transaction. This systematic erasure made it almost impossible for families to trace loved ones or prove their freedom once they disappeared. Yet kidnapping alone was not enough to sustain the family's ambitions. Competition in the illegal trade was fierce, and rivals constantly threatened their monopoly. For the matriarch, the solution was simple: eliminate them. Traders carrying cash, often thousands of dollars intended for purchases, became targets. They would be invited into the tavern, encouraged to drink and boast of their fortunes, and then murdered. Their wagons and enslaved companions were absorbed into the family's enterprise, while their bodies were hidden beneath the soil. One such case involved a Georgian trader traveling north with a large sum of money. He was last seen at the tavern, his horse later found in the family's possession. When questioned, the matriarch claimed he had continued south with a cargo of captives. But the truth was buried on her land, where his remains would one day resurface. These killings were not impulsive acts of violence, they were calculated business decisions. Murder removed competitors, secured wealth, and expanded the family's stock. Each grave was as much an entry in their ledger as it was a life extinguished. Their profits soared, but with each killing, they tightened the noose around their own. Next, within the tavern, the atmosphere was one of constant menace. Hidden cellars echoed with the chains of captives, while upstairs, the family conducted business as though nothing were amiss. Travelers drank at the bar, oblivious to the suffering beneath their feet. For the family, this dual existence became routine hospitality above, horror below. Testimonies from survivors later revealed the true scale of the terror. Lydia, whose voice carried from Philadelphia to court records, described months of captivity in those dark cellars. She recalled the hopelessness of knowing that even if she shouted, no one would believe her. Others spoke of children chained to walls, mothers begging for mercy, men beaten into submission. The family's cruelty extended even to infants, some of whom were killed outright when deemed too troublesome to transport. For those forced into complicity, the nightmare was worse still. Among the captives was a boy named Cyrus, enslaved by the family at a young age and raised within their household. As he grew, he was forced to assist in luring other victims, his survival dependent on obedience. He later testified to murders he had witnessed with his own eyes: children beaten, bodies buried, lives discarded like refuse. His account revealed not only the brutality of the crimes, but also the psychological manipulation that kept him bound. The matriarch alternated between treating him as a favored servant and threatening him with sale into harsher bondage. A cruel balance of dependency and fear. While fear silenced many, whispers of the family's deeds reached beyond their county. Mayor Joseph Watson's investigations in Philadelphia exposed a horrifying pattern. Dozens of free citizens vanished each year, their trails ending in the borderlands. His records, meticulously kept, painted a damning portrait of systematic kidnapping. Though Southern authorities often ignored such evidence, abolitionists seized upon it as proof of the vulnerability of free, black communities. Still, the law remained sluggish. Jurisdictional confusion, corruption, and prejudice created barriers. At every turn, local sheriffs often dismissed complaints, neighbors looked away, and courts hesitated to prosecute white families accused by black victims. The family relied on this apathy, confident that their crimes would remain hidden beneath layers of indifference. But even as they grew bolder, cracks appeared. Rivals they murdered had powerful backers, men with influence and money who demanded investigations. Survivors who escaped carried stories too compelling to ignore, and the sheer number of disappearances was becoming impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The matriarch's response to this mounting pressure was characteristic. She doubled down on violence. Rather than retreat, she sought to eliminate potential witnesses more aggressively. Anyone suspected of disloyalty was silenced. Associates who questioned her decisions vanished. Captives who resisted too loudly were killed rather than risk exposure. Her paranoia deepened, and the soil around the tavern grew heavier with the weight of the dead dot by now. The family's annual income was estimated at $50,000, a staggering fortune in the early 19th century. They lived as rural royalty, feared by neighbors and insulated by wealth. Yet their empire was built on fragile foundations: the silence of a community, the indifference of the law, and the secrecy of graves. None of these could last forever. The breaking point came in the spring of 1829, when the earth itself betrayed them. A tenant farmer, plowing a field recently cleared for cultivation, uncovered a wooden chest buried beneath the soil. Inside were bones human, unmistakable and damning. The discovery shocked even those who had long harbored suspicions. No longer whispers, no longer rumors. Here was evidence as solid as the earth itself. As word spread, authorities had no choice but to act. The investigation that followed would expose the family's crimes in unprecedented detail, unraveling decades of secrecy. Graves would be unearthed, testimonies recorded, and a criminal empire that had thrived in shadows would be dragged into the light. But before the reckoning came, there was still one final chapter in the family's reign of terror, a period of escalating violence, desperate cover-ups, and betrayals that would seal their fate. The spring of 1829 began like any other along the Maryland-Delaware border. Farmers tilled their fields, rivers swelled with seasonal rains, and life carried on with its usual rhythm. But one man's plow struck more than soil. As his horse stumbled into a soft depression in the earth, the farmer uncovered a secret that had been waiting decades to be revealed. A buried wooden chest, its edges rotting but still intact, lay just beneath the surface. Inside were human bones, their yellowed color and fractured skull telling a story of violence. At first, he thought it must have been some old battlefield, grave, or perhaps the remains of a traveler lost to the wilderness. But when word spread, neighbors whispered the unthinkable. This land belonged to the infamous family at the crossroads. And as more digging followed, the whispers hardened into certainty. Several more bodies were discovered nearby, including children. It was not an accident of history, nor a tragedy of nature. It was murder, deliberate and repeated. Authorities who had long ignored rumors now had no choice. The evidence was physical, undeniable, and horrifying. Graves were scattered across the property, shallow and crude, some containing wooden boxes that had clearly been constructed to hold human bodies. These were not hasty burials, but part of a system, a grim method perfected over years. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Many had harbored suspicions about the family for years, but to see bones pulled from the earth, to watch investigators lift skulls and shackles from shallow graves, that was something no one could deny. The tavern, once a symbol of rural authority and gathering, was revealed to be a house of death. Sheriff Joseph Hewson of Sussex County led the charge, coordinating with Maryland officials in an unprecedented joint investigation. For years, the family had evaded justice by exploiting the patchwork of jurisdictions, but now multiple states united to bring them down. Search warrants allowed officers to comb every inch of the property. They lifted floorboards, pried open cellars, and dug into gardens. What they uncovered confirmed the worst suspicions. Beneath the tavern lay hidden chambers designed for confinement. Chains were still fixed to walls, ventilation shafts cleverly concealed. The rooms smelled of damp rot, but also of fira, lingering reminder of those who had been imprisoned there. Outside, in gardens and fields, more bodies surfaced. Some were children, their remains tangled in small wooden boxes. Others were adults, showing signs of blunt force trauma or gunshot wounds. The earth, once silent, was now screaming. The most damning testimony came from someone who had lived inside the family's world. Cyrus, the boy enslaved by them since childhood, was captured during the sweep. At first he resisted speaking, fearing retribution even in custody. But when confronted with the certainty of death execution for crimes he had been forced to commit, he made a fateful decision. He would tell everything. Cyrus revealed that he had grown up in the household, forced to assist in kidnappings and lures. He had been a decoy, used to approach unsuspecting victims with promises of work. He described the horrors he had seen: children beaten, captives chained underground, bodies carried into fields under cover of night. His testimony was devastating, not only for its detail, but also for its corroboration of the physical evidence. He knew where graves were, and when investigators dug, they found bodies exactly where he said they would be. One account chilled even hardened officers. Cyrus recalled seeing the matriarch carry a wounded child outside in her apron. The child had been injured, but was still alive. Hours later, the child never returned. Another time, he witnessed a boy beaten to death with a piece of wood for refusing to remain silent about his free status. These were not random acts of violence, but systematic killings, calculated to remove threats and maximize profit. Neighbors who had once looked away now found their silence exposed. Some admitted they had long suspected foul play, but had been too afraid to speak. Others confessed to turning a blind eye in exchange for the family's money or favor. The complicity of the community became clear. The family had thrived not only because of their cunning, but because so many had chosen not to act. As the investigation spread, bodies continued to surface. A child's skeleton was found in the family's garden. Wooden boxes filled with bones appeared in shallow pits. In one case, the remains of a trader who had vanished years earlier were identified by personal items still clinging to his bones. The evidence painted a picture not of isolated crimes, but of a criminal empire that had murdered and trafficked for nearly 2 decades. The scale stunned investigators. Conservative estimates suggested hundreds of captives had passed through the tavern, many sold into slavery in the Deep South. Each one represented a stolen life, a shattered family, a voice silenced by profit. For the first time, authorities began to grasp the enormity of what had been unfolding in their own backyard. But the investigation was not just about bodies. It was about power. For years, the matriarch had ruled with iron authority, protected by fear, wealth, and geography. Now she was confronted with evidence that even she could not deny. Witnesses stepped forward, emboldened by the momentum. Survivors testified, their stories corroborating one another with chilling consistency. By April of 1829, indictments were handed down. 4 counts of murder were officially charged, though everyone involved knew the true number was far higher. The charges alone carried the death penalty, and the evidence was overwhelming. For the first time, the law had caught up with the family. In jail, the matriarch remained defiant. Contemporary accounts described her as unrepentant, even bewildered, as though she could not comprehend why her actions were being punished. To her, murder was business, kidnapping a transaction. She had spent decades treating human lives as property, and now she could not grasp why society was suddenly holding her accountable. Yet justice, in the end, would be complicated. The matriarch never stood trial. In May 1829, just weeks before proceedings were to begin, she was found dead in her cell. Poison, smuggled in by sympathizers or hoarded in secret, ended her life. Whether it was suicide or assisted escape from justice remains uncertain. What is certain is that she denied the victims' families the satisfaction of a public reckoning. Her death marked both an ending and a continuation. The immediate threat was gone, but her network lived on. Some of her relatives and associates fled south, continuing their criminal activities beyond the reach of Delaware law. Others melted into obscurity, their crimes buried alongside their victims. The investigation that began with a farmer's plow had pulled back the curtain, but many details remained unresolved. The legacy of the family lingered long after the tavern fell silent. Their crimes exposed the vulnerability of free black communities, the corruption of local authorities, and the staggering profits of human trafficking in early America. They showed how a single family, operating with ruthless determination, could terrorize a region for decades under the cloak of silence. In the end, it was not law enforcement ingenuity or public outrage that undid them. It was the earth itself. Graves refused to keep their secrets forever, and when the soil of 1829 gave up its dead, it spoke louder than any witness could. When the Graves began yielding their secrets in 1829, there was no longer any room for denial. The tavern at the crossroads was not just a house with a dark reputation. It was the headquarters of America's deadliest crime family. As investigators collected evidence and survivors testified, the case against the matriarch hardened into a narrative of systematic brutality that shocked even those who thought themselves hardened to frontier violence. By early April, indictments were issued. 4 charges of murder were formally brought against her, though everyone knew the true toll stretched far beyond those 4 lives. Prosecutors had chosen their cases carefully, selecting victims whose remains had been recovered and whose stories could be supported by witnesses. They wanted a trial that could not be dismissed as rumor or hearsay. Each charge carried the death penalty. The news electrified the region. Newspapers from Philadelphia to Baltimore devoted columns to the story. Readers were horrified not only by the murders, but by the revelation that a woman, an elderly one at that, had orchestrated such a reign of terror. Gender roles of the early 19th century did not easily accommodate the image of a female serial killer, let alone one who commanded men and ran a cross-state network of crime. For many, the matriarch's very existence was an affront to social expectations, a living contradiction that made her story all the more sensational. The jail in Georgetown, Delaware, was not built to hold a prisoner like her. It was a modest stone structure designed for debtors, drunks, and the occasional horse thief. Now it housed one of the most notorious criminals in the young nation's history. Guards reinforced her cell with iron bars and heavy locks, fearing both escape and retaliation. Rumors circulated that her surviving associates might attempt a rescue, though nothing of the sort ever materialized. Within the jail, she remained an imposing figure. At nearly 70 years old, she was described as tall and broad-shouldered, her voice still carrying the same sharp authority that had cowed neighbors and criminals alike. Prison officials noted that she showed no sign of remorse. On the contrary, she spoke of her crimes with a chilling casualness, as if kidnapping, murder, and trafficking were mere business transactions. To her, the world had always been divided into 2 kinds of people: those who could be used and those who could not. Prosecutors, led by Delaware's Attorney General James Rogers, assembled their case with painstaking care. They knew the eyes of the nation were upon them. The trial would not only decide the fate of one woman, it would signal whether American law could reach across race, gender, and state lines to hold a criminal enterprise accountable. Their strategy was straightforward. Present the physical evidence: bodies in boxes, chains in cellars, graves in gardens. Then amplify it with testimony from witnesses like Cyrus, the boy who had grown up inside the family's world. his knowledge of burial sites, his detailed accounts of murders, and his descriptions of captives in the tavern cellars made him invaluable. Other witnesses came forward too. Survivors like Lydia Smith, who had endured months in chains before her rescue, spoke of the misery inflicted upon captives. Neighbors, emboldened now that the family's power was broken, admitted what they had long suspected. Even merchants confessed to selling supplies without asking questions. Piece by piece, a portrait of complicity and cruelty emerged. The prosecution's greatest weapon was the physical evidence. Unlike many trials of the era, which relied heavily on testimony, this case had bones in boxes, skulls split by violence, chains embedded in cellar walls. These artifacts spoke louder than any lawyer. They turned rumor into reality and forced jurors to confront the undeniable. But the defense, weak as it was, hoped to exploit her age and gender. Her lawyers argued that she was too old, too frail, to have committed the murders herself. They suggested she was guilty of association at worst, manipulated by the men around her. It was a strategy that appealed to contemporary notions of women as passive and submissive. But anyone who had encountered her knew the truth, that she had ruled the family with an iron will, and that men had followed her, not the other way around. Even so, the trial promised to be a spectacle. Observers from across the region planned to attend, hungry to witness the downfall of a woman who had defied every social expectation. The courtroom in Georgetown was prepared for a crush of visitors, its benches likely to overflow with reporters, neighbors, and the merely curious. For many, it was not just about justice. It was about seeing with their own eyes the woman who had become a legend of fear. Yet the trial would never take place. On May 11, 1829, guards found her dead in her cell. She had taken poison, smuggled in by unknown hands, or perhaps saved from earlier days. Some believed sympathizers had slipped her arsenic during a visit. Others thought she had been hoarding medicine for months. However it was obtained, the result was the same. The matriarch robbed the court, the victims' families, and the public of a final reckoning. Her death stunned the community. After decades of impunity, after months of investigation, after weeks of anticipation, justice was denied at the very last moment. There would be no trial, no jury, no formal conviction. Only a body lying lifeless on a cell floor, the story of her crimes left unresolved in the eyes of the law. Some saw her suicide as cowardice, a refusal to face the consequences she had inflicted on so many others. Others interpreted it as her final act of control. For years, she had dictated the terms of life and death. Now, facing execution, she chose to dictate her own end. In that sense, she died as she had lived on her own terms. Defiant to the last dot, her body was buried in the yard of the Georgetown jail, unmarked and without ceremony. Later, when the land was redeveloped, her remains were moved to a potter's field. Her skull, however, was separated from her body and passed from institution to institution as a grim curiosity. Even in death, she remained an object of fascination, her crimes preserved in bone. Though she never stood trial, her story had already reshaped the region. The investigation exposed not only her family's crimes, but also the systemic failures that allowed them to thrive. The vulnerability of free black communities, the corruption of local officials, the indifference of neighbors, all had enabled her reign. The scandal forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about slavery, race, and justice in a nation that prided itself on liberty. For the victims' families, however, the ending was bitter. They had hoped to see her convicted, to watch the law condemn her as she had condemned so many others. Instead, they were left with unanswered questions and an uneasy sense of unfinished justice. Her death closed the chapter, but it did not erase the crimes. The courtroom had been prepared. The witnesses had been assembled. The jury was ready to hear the case. But the story of America's deadliest crime family would never find resolution in a court of law. Instead, it would linger in memory, in folklore, and in the uneasy knowledge that justice, once again, had come too late. The death of the matriarch in May 1829 should have ended the nightmare. With her buried in the soil of Georgetown, many hoped the story of America's deadliest crime family would be sealed away with her. Yet history is rarely so neat. The woman, who had orchestrated kidnappings, murders, and sales across state lines was gone, but her family was not. And neither was the network she had spent decades building. In the days following her death, investigators swept the tavern and surrounding farms again, looking for hidden caches of money, documents, or accomplices. What they found suggested the scope of the enterprise had been far larger than anyone imagined. Receipts for slave auctions in Virginia, bills of sale from markets as far south as Georgia, and letters referencing shipments all pointed to a network that reached deep into the South. The tavern was not merely a local den of crime. It had been the headquarters of a supply chain feeding one of the most profitable industries in America. The matriarch's death left her children and close associates exposed. Some were arrested and questioned, but few faced serious charges. The same weaknesses in the justice system that had allowed the family to operate for so long now hindered accountability. Without her as the central figure, prosecutors struggled to prove individual responsibility. Witnesses who had been willing to testify against her found it harder to implicate lesser members. Some feared retribution. Others doubted courts would convict anyone else after the spectacle of her suicide. Still, a handful of relatives were convicted on lesser charges, often for abduction rather than murder. Sentences ranged from a few years in prison to heavy fines, punishments that seemed trivial compared to the crimes. Many others slipped away entirely, vanishing into the South, where their skills in trafficking human beings remained in demand. Evidence suggests that at least 2 of her sons relocated to Virginia, where they continued the trade under new names. Survivors later reported seeing familiar faces in slave pens, men who had once lured captives to the Crossroads Tavern, now bargaining in markets hundreds of miles away. The methods were the same, kidnapping free black citizens, destroying their papers, and reselling them as runaways. The death of their mother had not erased their craft. It had simply relocated it for neighbors who had lived in fear for decades. The family's collapse brought a strange mix of relief and unease. The tavern, once bustling with secret traffic, now stood silent, its windows boarded, its cellars empty. Some saw it as cursed, a monument to cruelty. Others avoided it altogether, unwilling to confront the memories it stirred. Farmers tilled their land, but every time a plow struck something hard in the soil, dread returned. Even years later, bones would occasionally surface, grim reminders that the earth had not yet finished telling its story. Abolitionists seized upon the revelations. Pamphlets circulated in northern cities, describing the family's crimes as evidence of slavery's corrupting influence. The story of kidnapped free people, dragged south into bondage, became a rallying cry. Meetings in Philadelphia and New York echoed with outrage, activists pointing to the case as proof that no free black person was truly safe while slavery endured. For them, the matriarch's death was not the end, but a beginning, a symbol of what they fought against. Yet in the South, the reaction was more muted. Slave traders dismissed the case as an anomaly, a single deranged woman rather than a symptom of systemic abuse. Buyers rarely asked questions about where captives came from, and Southern markets continued to thrive on the steady flow of human cargo. The family's legacy lived on, not as a cautionary tale, but as a template others quietly followed. Among the black communities of Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, the scars ran deepest. Families who had lost loved ones now had confirmation of what they had long suspected. Mothers who had searched for missing sons, fathers who had called for daughters who never returned, finally understood where their paths had ended. For them, justice had not been served. The matriarch's suicide felt like theft, a stolen trial that denied them the closure of hearing her condemned aloud. Worse still, many of her accomplices walked free, their names unpunished, their crimes unacknowledged. Cyrus, the boy who had testified against the family, found himself in a precarious position. Though his words had been vital to the investigation, his association with the tavern tainted him in the eyes of many. Some abolitionists saw him as a tragic figure, a victim forced into complicity. Others viewed him with suspicion, unable to separate his coerced role from the crimes he had witnessed. Records of his later life are scarce, but it is clear he bore the burden of memory. His testimony had exposed the horror, yet he remained a prisoner of it long after the tavern was shuttered. The matriarch's skull, preserved as a curiosity, became a grotesque emblem of her story. Passed from private collections to museums, it was displayed as evidence of female criminality, a macabre relic of phrenological studies that sought to explain her violence through the shape of her bones. Instead of serving as a solemn reminder of the victims, it became an object of fascination, diverting attention from the hundreds of lives she had destroyed by the 1830s. The story of the crime family had already begun to fade from public memory. Other scandals took its place, other crimes filled the headlines, yet in the borderlands the legend persisted. Travelers spoke of the tavern in hushed tones, calling it haunted ground. Some claimed to hear voices at night, the cries of captives, echoing through the empty cellars. Farmers swore their horses shied away from the fields where bodies had been buried. The land itself seemed unwilling to forget. For historians, the family's legacy is not just a tale of crime, but a window into the fragility of freedom in early America. Their story revealed how laws meant to protect free black citizens could be so easily undermined by prejudice and corruption. It showed how communities, paralyzed by fear or complicit in greed, could allow atrocities to flourish in their midst. And it demonstrated how the lure of profit could twist human beings into predators, devouring the very society that enabled them. The matriarch was gone, but the shadows she cast remained. Her children carried her methods south, her crimes fueled abolitionist fire, and her story lingered in folklore as a reminder that evil does not end neatly with a single death. America's deadliest crime family had been unmasked, but its legacy endured in the soil, in memory, and in the silence of those who had chosen not to speak until it was too late. The death of the matriarch did not silence her story. If anything, it gave it wings. Newspapers in the spring and summer of 1829 carried sensational accounts of the investigation, the suicided prisoner, and the bodies unearthed in shallow graves. Editors competed for the most lurid details, and readers devoured every word. What had once been whispered in borderland taverns was now printed for a national audience. The crime family, once feared locally, became infamous everywhere. The coverage revealed not just the crimes, but the cultural appetite for them. In a young republic fascinated with tales of frontier justice and outlaws, the matriarch's story fit perfectly into the genre of cautionary horror. She was framed as a female fiend, a woman who had stepped so far outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior that she seemed monstrous. Her gender, which had once shielded her from suspicion, now amplified her infamy. She was described as unfeminine, brutal, even demonic. For readers who believed women were naturally nurturing and submissive, she became the embodiment of corruption, a warning of what happened when social order unraveled. But newspapers were not the only stage. Oral tradition carried the story into folklore. Farmers told their children to behave, warning that the ghost of the crossroads matriarch would snatch misbehaving boys and girls in the night. Travelers passing the abandoned tavern claimed to see lights in the windows or to hear the faint sound of chains rattling in the cellar. For decades, locals avoided the property after dark, convinced the land itself was cursed by the blood spilled there. The abolitionist movement found in her story a powerful tool. Pamphlets recounted the kidnappings of free black citizens, framing the case as proof of slavery's corrupt reach. Public lectures invoked her name as an example of how greed could warp human souls and how the existence of slavery created opportunities for atrocities, even in states that claimed to be free. Abolitionist newspapers in Philadelphia and Boston published serialized accounts, ensuring that her legacy endured not just as scandal, but as political ammunition. Southern responses were very different. In markets where enslaved people were bought and sold, the case was downplayed. Traders insisted that the family was an aberration, a singular evil rather than a reflection of the trade itself. To admit otherwise would have meant questioning the entire institution. Thus, while Northerners pointed to her crimes as evidence of systemic injustice, Southerners dismissed them as the acts of a deranged woman. Yet beneath the surface, her methods lived on. Whispers of kidnappings persisted throughout the 1830s and 1840s. Free black families continued to guard their papers carefully, aware that one missing document could doom them. Posters for missing children and husbands still appeared in northern cities, and suspicion often pointed south. Even when her name was not spoken, her shadow lingered. Literature of the 19th century occasionally drew upon her legend. Early true crime pamphlets, popular among readers hungry for grisly detail, included chapters on the family's atrocities. Sensationalist writers embellished the facts, portraying her as a sorceress or a vampire feeding on human life. These exaggerations blurred the line between reality and myth, transforming her from a historical figure into a figure of American Gothic. For local communities, the tavern itself became a focal point of folklore. Children dared one another to creep near its collapsing walls. Adults swore they heard cries at night, though reason told them it was only the wind. Some claimed the soil near the old graves would never grow crops properly, as though the land rejected cultivation after so much blood had seeped into it. Farmers avoided renting or buying the property, leaving it to decay into ruins. Meanwhile, academics in the mid-19th century turned her skull into an object of study. Phrenologists, who believed the shape of the skull revealed character, displayed it at lectures to illustrate the supposed physical marks of criminality. Crowds stared at the bone of the woman once feared in life, reducing her to a curiosity, a freak specimen in pseudoscientific exhibitions. The macabre irony was that while her skull drew fascination, the lives of her victims were largely forgotten. By the time the Civil War erupted, her story had been woven into both abolitionist rhetoric and campfire ghost tales. For Union soldiers, she was sometimes invoked as proof of the wickedness that slavery encouraged. For Confederate sympathizers, she was a Northern smear, exaggerated to tarnish the South's reputation. Once again, her memory became a battlefield pressed into service. For competing causes, what made her story endure was not just the scale of her crimes, but the questions they raised. How could such atrocities occur in plain sight? Why had neighbors remained silent? How had the law failed to protect free citizens? Each generation that revisited the tale found new meaning in it. For some, she was a monster, proof of evil incarnate. For others, she was a mirror reflecting the failures of a nation unwilling to confront its contradictions. The folklore of the crossroads never died. Into the late 19th century, newspapers occasionally reprinted the story, often on anniversaries of her death. Reporters returned to the tavern's ruins, describing ivy-covered walls and overgrown fields as though they were haunted relics. Tourists came to see the site where America's deadliest crime family once reigned. Photographs of the ruins circulated, solidifying its place in the visual memory of the nation. Even in the 20th century, echoes remained. Writers of local histories in Delaware and Maryland revisited the case, weaving it into broader narratives of slavery and crime. Ghost hunters, folklorists, and amateur historians claimed to feel a presence in the soil, to hear whispers in the cellar, to sense that the earth had not yet fully released its dead. The matriarch, though long gone, seemed never to rest. Yet what endures most is not her, but the silence of her victims. Hundreds of lives stolen, families shattered, names erased. Their voices are faint in the historical record, overshadowed by the infamy of the woman who destroyed them. But in every retelling, in every ghost story or pamphlet or newspaper column, their absence lingers. The horror of her crimes is inseparable from the reminder of all that was lost. The transition from headline to folklore shows the dual nature of memory. Facts can fade, details can shift, but stories remain. In the crossroads of Delaware, history and legend entwined, ensuring that the crime family would never fully vanish. They had sought to erase their victims, but instead, their own name became a permanent stain on the American story. By the mid-19th century, the matriarch and her crime family had already shifted from living memory into history. Yet unlike countless other violent figures of early America, she did not vanish into obscurity. Her story refused to die. It resurfaced in abolitionist pamphlets, in sensational crime tracts, and later in the works of historians who recognized that what had happened along the Delaware-Maryland border was more than just an isolated scandal. It was a window into the contradictions of a nation struggling with freedom and slavery. For abolitionists, the case remained a weapon long after her death. They pointed to the kidnappings as proof that slavery poisoned everything it touched. Even in so-called free states, free black families lived in fear because the demand for enslaved labor in the South created opportunities for predators. The matriarch became the face of that predation. Lecturers at anti-slavery meetings described her tavern of horrors, using her crimes to jolt audiences into outrage. By highlighting the brutality inflicted not by anonymous systems, but by a flesh and blood family, abolitionists brought the abstract injustice of slavery into terrifying focus. When the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, her story took on new layers of meaning. Reconstruction-era newspapers revisited the case as a reminder of the dangers free African Americans had faced in the decades before emancipation. For many, her reign was proof of how fragile liberty had been, how quickly it could be stolen. In the testimonies of survivors, historians found a direct link between individual crime and systemic oppression. The family may have acted out of greed, but the environment that allowed them to flourish was built on the broader tolerance of bondage. At the same time, popular culture turned her into something else, an icon of early American crime. Pamphleteers and dime novelists exaggerated her deeds, casting her as a Gothic villainess. In some accounts, she became almost mythical, a devil woman who drank blood or communed with spirits. These distortions blurred fact and fiction, but they also kept her memory alive. Readers who knew nothing of Delaware or Maryland could still describe the woman at the crossroads, whose cruelty became legend. Historians of the late 19th and early 20th centuries treated her more cautiously, though fascination remained. They documented the court records, the skeletal remains, and the testimony of witnesses. Some dismissed the folklore, but many recognized that myth and fact were inseparable. The myths themselves revealed how communities processed trauma, how people explained the unexplainable by cloaking it in supernatural imagery. Even when stripped of exaggeration, the facts were chilling enough. A family empire built on the abduction, imprisonment, and sale of human beings, overseen by a woman who showed no remorse. By the early 20th century, the case was often taught in regional histories as an example of lawlessness on the borderlands. Teachers in Delaware and Maryland referenced it to illustrate how fragile justice had once been, and how local fear had allowed atrocities to persist. In academic circles, her story was used as evidence of the risks faced by free black populations. In the antebellum North, legal scholars pointed to the case as a study in jurisdictional weakness, how borders between states became shields for criminals. Crime as a genre was beginning to emerge, and her name inevitably appeared in early anthologies. Collections of notorious murders from the colonial and early Republican eras nearly always included a chapter on the Crossroads family. These accounts leaned into lurid detail, describing the hidden cellars, the rattling chains, and the bones unearthed by the plow. They cemented her place in a tradition of crime literature that fascinated readers with stories of cruelty, while offering moral lessons about the dangers of greed and vice. But as the 20th century progressed, reformers began to reinterpret the case. For them, the focus shifted away from the villain and toward the victims. Historians researching African American communities in the 19th century revisited the story not to marvel at her evil, but to honor those whose names had been erased. Through painstaking research, they pieced together fragments, runaway ads, court petitions, family testimonies. These fragments revealed how free black families had resisted, how they had organized networks of support, and how the fear of kidnapping shaped daily life. In this reinterpretation, the crime family was no longer the center. The victims were. This reframing also influenced how the case was remembered publicly. Historical markers and museum exhibits in Delaware eventually acknowledged the family's crimes, but with emphasis on the broader context of the illegal slave trade. Rather than presenting the matriarch as a monstrous exception, historians situated her within a system of economic exploitation that made her crimes possible. The Crossroads Tavern was not a supernatural aberration. It was a grotesque symptom of a society that tolerated and profited from human suffering. Meanwhile, her legend continued to inspire ghost stories. Writers of the 20th century wove her into collections of American folklore, describing the tavern as haunted ground. Some tales claimed travelers still heard chains clanking beneath the earth, or saw the silhouette of a woman standing at the crossroads, waiting to lure the unsuspecting. These stories, while far removed from historical accuracy, kept her alive in the cultural imagination. For many Americans, she was less a historical figure than a bogey woman, invoked to scare children or entertain tourists. The dual legacies, history and folklore, remained entwined. Scholars examined court documents, abolitionist tracts, and archaeological finds, while local storytellers passed along tales of restless spirits. Together they formed a layered memory, part fact, part myth, but always bound by the same truth. A family had turned their home into a factory of human misery, and the community had allowed it to happen for far too long. By the late 20th century, the story had found its way into university classrooms. Courses on American slavery, women in crime, and the history of policing used the case to highlight larger themes. Students were asked to consider how a woman, in a society that often treated women as powerless, could exercise such ruthless authority. They were encouraged to examine how race and law intersected in ways that made kidnapping profitable. In these discussions, the Crossroads family became less of a grotesque curiosity and more of a lens through which to study American history itself. And so, nearly 2 centuries after her death, the verdict of history had been written. She was not merely a criminal mastermind, nor merely a ghost story. She was a symptom of a nation's contradictions, a reminder that ideals of liberty coexisted with practices of bondage. Her crimes were not random acts of evil. They were facilitated by laws, by neighbors, by silence, and by profit. America's deadliest crime family thrived because a society allowed it to thrive. That, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all. History judged her guilty, but it also judged the world that made her possible. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since the tavern at the crossroads fell silent. The matriarch is long buried, her children scattered, and her house reduced to dust. Yet the story of America's deadliest crime family endures, woven into the fabric of both history and folklore. To this day, it lingers as one of the darkest reminders of what unchecked greed and human cruelty can produce. Modern historians approach the case with a different lens than the newspapers of 1829 or the pamphleteers of the 19th century. Where earlier generations emphasized the sensational horror of a murderous woman, today's scholarship recognizes something deeper. The family's crimes were not isolated acts of madness. They were made possible by a society that valued profit over human dignity, that allowed borders, loopholes, and prejudice to turn free men and women into merchandise. The tavern at the crossroads was not an outlier, but an extension of the slave markets that thrived across the South. In this light, the matriarch becomes both less extraordinary and more disturbing. She was not a monster conjured from the shadows. She was an entrepreneur of brutality who exploited the vulnerabilities built into her world. The laws of the United States, uneven, fragmented, and racially biased, made her success possible. The silence of neighbors, the complicity of merchants, the corruption of minor officials, all formed the soil in which her empire grew, thrived because her community permitted it, and because the nation itself tolerated it. And yet, the legend persists alongside the history. Local folklore still paints her as a ghostly figure wandering the crossroads, a woman in dark clothing with chains dragging behind her. Tourists to Delaware and Maryland sometimes seek out the sites associated with her story, eager to glimpse ruins or feel the chill of haunted ground. For them, she is less a historical figure and more a character in America's Gothic imagination, standing beside witches, pirates, and outlaws in the pantheon of legends. True crime culture, which has flourished in the modern era, has rediscovered her story. Documentaries, podcasts, and books revisit the family's crimes, framing them as part of the long lineage of American violence. The fascination lies partly in the sheer scale of the cruelty, but also in the paradox of power, that a woman in the early 19th century, when women were denied so many rights, could rise to become one of the most feared figures of her time. She subverted gender expectations not by breaking chains, but by forging them. In doing so, she challenges easy assumptions about power, victimhood, and agency. For African American communities, however, the legacy is far more personal. The descendants of those who lived in fear of kidnapping still carry stories of vigilance, grandparents reminding children never to walk alone, families preserving freedom papers in hidden places, communities banding together to protect one another. The terror spread by the crime family did not vanish with their deaths. It etched itself into cultural memory, shaping habits of caution that lasted generations. Archaeologists in the 20th and 21st centuries have attempted to uncover traces of the tavern and its victims. Every bone fragment, every rusted chain, every cellar wall that collapses into view reminds us that history is not abstract. It is buried beneath our feet, waiting to be acknowledged. Excavations reveal the physical evidence of lives stolen, of voices silenced. They shift the focus from the matriarch's infamy to the humanity of those she destroyed. In that sense, modern research has become an act of restoration, giving back dignity to those she tried to erase. Museums and historical societies in Delaware now address the story openly, presenting it not as a tale of morbid curiosity, but as part of the larger narrative of slavery and freedom in America. School programs teach students not just about the crimes, but about the context, how racism, law, and silence allowed the crimes to persist. In this way, the story becomes more than horror. It becomes a lesson. It warns that injustice flourishes, not only because of the wicked, but also because of those who look away. The question remains, why does her story continue to grip us? Perhaps it is because it touches on so many of America's contradictions. It is about freedom and slavery, law and lawlessness, gender and power, silence and complicity. It reminds us that evil does not always come dressed as the extraordinary. Sometimes it looks like a family at a tavern, a house on a hill, neighbors at a crossroads. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice in the end. The matriarch's name is remembered not because she was powerful, but because she revealed how fragile liberty could be. Her tavern stands as a metaphor for the darker rooms of America's past rooms, where justice was locked away and humanity was treated as cargo. Though she is gone, her story remains because it forces us to confront the shadows of a nation that proclaimed freedom while permitting bondage. The legacy of America's deadliest crime family is not just the horror of what they did, but the warning of what happens when profit is valued above people, when silence protects cruelty, and when law bends to the will of those who exploit it. It is a legacy that insists on vigilance, reminding us that justice must be defended, not assumed. Today, the Crossroads Tavern is no more. The cellars have collapsed, the fields have grown over, and the graves have merged with the soil. But the echoes remain in folklore, in history, in the careful work of scholars, and in the quiet stories passed down through families who never forgot. The matriarch is gone, but the questions she leaves behind are eternal. Who do we protect? Who do we silence? And how easily can freedom be stolen when a society chooses not to see? That is why her story endures, not as a curiosity, not as a ghost tale, but as a warning carved into the memory of a nation. A reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones we imagine in the dark. They are the ones we allow to live among us in the light.